All right, we're evaluating the following expressions for x equal to -1, y equal to 3, and z equal to -2. So for each expression, we want to make sure we keep track of the composition of it. So here we have three terms. Um, the x is a factor in the first term. We have factors of -4 and y in the second term. And then we have a factor of -1 and z in the third term. So now we're just going to replace the values for the variables x equal to -1. We're going to put that in the factor for x. In the middle term, we have -4, then y. We're going to replace y with 3 in that factor. And then z, we have a factor of -2. So now we can evaluate each of the terms. The first term is just -1, of course. The second term would be a -12 when I multiply those factors together. And the third term would be a +2. So combining these like terms, we have a -1 and a -10. So combining the -12 and 2, and then combining -1 and -10 is -11. So again, we want to break down the composition of each of these expressions. So for b, we have three terms again. And the factors in each term, the first term is a factor of 2, and then a factor of x, and that's squared. The middle term has factors of -3 and x, and then we have this 5 as a factor here. So when we simplify, or excuse me, when we evaluate, we're plugging in the value for -1 for x. We plug in a -1 into those factors. So we're replacing the x with the factor of -1 in each term. So now we know we want to evaluate each term. The first term is 2 times 1. So that first term is going to be a +2. The second term, or the middle term, is a -3 times -1, which is a +3. And the last term, of course, is just +5. So all of our terms are evaluated now. We could just combine like terms, we get 10. So for C, again, we want to look at the composition. We have two separate terms. The first term is just a 7. We just keep track of that. The factors in the second term are a -1, and then the square root of the inside. So inside this factor, we have two terms. We have a y, which is a value of 3, and x, we have a -6 times an x, which is a factor of -1. So all of that is under the square root, and I need to keep track of that factor. So just working with this term, I got -1, the square root. This would be a 3 plus 6, which is the same as the square root of 9. So again, I'm just keeping track of the factors on this term. -1 times 3 is finally a -3. So the two terms are 7 and -3, and when I combine those together, I get a 4 for my answer. So D, again, I see two terms. The first term is a factor of -1, and then a factor inside the parentheses squared. So the second term has a factor of -1, and then a z squared. So when I plug in for y and x, I realize I have two terms here. Y, again, is 3. And then I'm subtracting an x, which is -1, a factor of -1. So inside the parentheses would be a 3 plus 1, which is a 4 squared. So the factors in that first term are -1, and then the 4 squared. This would be a -1 times 16, or the term would be -16. So when I plug the z value in, z is actually equal to -2. So if I plug that in for that factor here, this would be a -1 times the factor -2 squared is 4. So this becomes a term of -4. So I have a -4 and a -16, which is -20.